Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's digital event, Transforming Place, hosted by CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board. My name is Mel, and I'm an event delivery coordinator at CMI, and I'll shortly be handing over to Catherine to begin today's event. If you have any questions during the digital event, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can during the Q&A. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be shared later on today for those who have booked to attend. Event recording will also be available on the CMI website and CMI YouTube channel. Now over to Catherine, Deputy Chair and Diversity and Inclusion Lead of the CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board.
Thanks, Mel. Welcome everyone to the 5th digital event in our transformation series, Transforming Place. Today we're delighted to be joined by Professor Denise Skinner. Denise is an Emeritus Professor at Coventry University. She's currently working on a large leadership programme in the public sector, and she was CMI's Volunteer of the Year in 2020. In today's event, we're going to be exploring some topics such as how people's expectations have changed during COVID, what are the benefits to individuals of going back into the office, when adopting hybrid working, what do we need to think about to make sure that time spent in the office is value added? What do we need to think about to ensure consistency of approach to staff in different locations? And with a high demand for labour, can leaders afford not to reconsider how we define place? So welcome, Denise. Thanks for joining us. If you could just give a little bit of a brief introduction to yourself, and then we'll kick off.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I think Catherine's covered the main points. And if you looked at my bio in the sort of run up to this, you'll know that I have quite a breadth of background. I've worked in the public sector. I've owned 2 businesses and been an owner director of a retail business. I've sat on boards. I've worked in the voluntary sector as a volunteer rather than a paid employee. So I've had quite a range of experience and expertise, and I've been thinking a lot about what the last 18 months has done to the workplace. Hence, Catherine inviting me to come along for this chat.
Excellent, super. So, Denise, let's start the discussion with the first point. So, how have people's expectations around the workplace changed during COVID?
Well, I think we all recognise the fact that the last 18 months have been very disruptive in all sorts of workplaces and in people's lives. So it would be amazing if people's expectations hadn't changed. Even those who perhaps have not been able to work at home, but have been furloughed, perhaps because they work in hospitality or in the front line, say in retail, their expectations have changed nevertheless, I think. So if we think about what it's meant to people, first and foremost, I think we need to recognise people's concerns about safety and about what working in their workplace means in terms of social interaction, social distancing, the precautions that they need to take. And they have lots of concerns about those sorts of things, understandably, particularly with, as we're told today, numbers of COVID infections are rising. So it's on the forefront of people's minds. But I think broader than that, for many people, the pandemic has almost fast forwarded a lot of the arguments around flexible working, the ability to work away from a set location and how effective that can be, because people have managed to be productive and in some cases even more productive than when they've been in their traditional workplace all over the pandemic. So they have expectations, and I think certainly people are less willing to accept that there's only one way of working. And I think where people haven't had the commute, particularly those who have a lengthy commute, I think the average commute time in the UK currently is 59 minutes. For some, it'll be a great deal less, but for some, it's significantly more, particularly in the sort of the conurbations like London, Manchester, Birmingham. And they've been given that time back. And for many people, that's changed their work-life balance. And so people don't just accept now that the commute is inevitable, an inevitable part of whatever job they did. So I think people are thinking about those things more consciously than before. Certainly in recent surveys that have been done, the majority of people are saying that they expect to be able to work flexibly, that they expect to work in a hybrid form, whatever that may be in the context of their organisation. And 47% of people in a recent poll cited by the CMI in their recent magazine on hybrid working, said that actually if they weren't allowed to have some form of flexible working, they would leave the employer. So it really is high on people's agendas. They really have been thinking about this, and they've been shown that another way is possible. So I don't think we can ignore that.
Excellent. So that sort of that does lead us into another question. So how do we tempt people or encourage them to go back into the office, given all of the benefits we've just talked about for having a flexible and a hybrid working model?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that not everybody will view returning to the office in the same way. Some people will actually embrace the return to the office, either because they've really missed the workplace and the working environment that they experienced before the pandemic. We know that there have been significant numbers of people who've suffered from loneliness during the pandemic. And a contributor to that has been the absence of being able to actually have exchanges face-to-face with work colleagues and just experience that working environment where they're sitting with their team or whatever. So some people won't need a great deal of encouragement. They're looking forward. It's a step towards normality. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for. Even if they perhaps had a lot of positives during lockdown, people want to embrace normality. They want to go back to a way of life that feels more normal than we've had the last 18 months. But we also need to recognise that there are a lot of people who will be less keen. And I think what's really important here is dialogue. We have to talk to people, engage with people, understand where any reluctance comes from, understand how their needs might have changed during the pandemic. They may be balancing different responsibilities now than they were previously. Some people will have been through a period of bereavement and grief, which, that will still be with them. And it may have changed how they see their work-life balance requirements and their perception of the workplace. We also need to think carefully about what people expect in terms of safety, as I mentioned before. What measures do they feel need to be in place so they can feel comfortable and confident to come back to work? So I think those are where we need to start. You need to consider why people are coming into the office. Why are they going to be there? And it has to feel worthwhile, particularly if there's a long commute involved, particularly if it means that juggling your life commitments have become more complicated because you now have to arrange to go to a different place of work. So there are lots of reasons why people may want to come into the office. These can certainly be emphasised in any discussions that are being had. Certainly one of the areas that people have flagged up that they have missed are to do with interaction with people, engagement with their teammates, engagement with the wider workforce. Things like workshops and team days work better face-to-face. It's quite difficult purely through Zoom, telephone, whatever, to be spontaneous in the way that you are if you're all sat around a table, or if you're all gathered for coffee, or if you're all gathered in a corridor or walking in the corridor and you just happen to share thoughts with somebody and suddenly it sparks something else. And it's easier to be spontaneously creative when you're actually with other people. And people value those things. So I think we need to be thinking about our office spaces, our workplace spaces, in the sense of how can we encourage the aspects of interaction that people value, that people are willing to come to the workplace for, because they feel they take something from it, and they feel that they're getting value added. So I think that's very important. I think we also need to give thought to the new joiners, the people who've actually come into the organisation during the pandemic, where it hasn't been possible to onboard them in the way we normally would. When they'd attend the office, they'd sit with people, they'd meet people on an informal basis. And I think certainly a lot of people who are keen to come back to the office are those people who are relatively new. They may be new in the sense of they're only recently joined the workforce, or they may be new in the sense of they've recently joined this organisation. And I think a lot of people feel that they have missed some of that informal interaction that you get that allows you to become embedded in the organisation and in the teams that you're part of. It's much more difficult on Zoom to achieve that, I think. So all of these are reasons to encourage people to come back to the office. But I think what we really need to do is carefully think about how those interactions are going to be facilitated. People are not going to be impressed if you bring them back into the office and sit them in a little cubicle where they don't talk to anybody. They have little opportunity for engagement or added value. They could do that at home. They don't need to come to the office to do that. So we need to be thinking about how we make the office a place where people have opportunities that they just couldn't get if they just stayed at home and worked from home.
I guess it's about there's an element of risk management there, isn't there? Sort of how do you create an environment where people can get those sort of serendipitous creative opportunities balanced with, not, as you said, not sitting people in a cubicle on their own, which could be done from anywhere.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think that needs to be thought through. And I think this is a great time to actually reconsider how we're using our workplace spaces, because you're obviously not starting with a blank page, but in the sense that people have been away from those spaces for some considerable time, a lot of the sort of norms and assumptions that underpinned how we created our spaces and how we used our spaces are probably weaker now than they've ever been, because people haven't been there for a long time. So it's an opportunity to maybe recreate some of those spaces, reimagine some of those spaces in a way that works better for the organizations that we have now, rather than the organizations that we had pre-pandemic.
It feels like there's a significant opportunity in terms of how we use them, and again, design of the organizational space, and how we make sure the spaces are set up for that level of communication and serendipitous exchange of information.
Exactly, and to encourage that to happen, but you've got to also do that in the context of safety. So in that sense, you've got to balance both of those things against each other. You want to create spaces where people can engage, but equally we have to be mindful of COVID regulations, of the need still to be careful to manage the rate of infection. So it's, in many cases, it's not an easy line to walk, but I think it's one worth walking.
Definitely. Excellent. Okay. So what are the issues that leaders should be thinking about when they're managing hybrid teams with people who are located both at home and in the office? And what do they need to consider to make sure that as we've just said, it's going to be value adding for people that are in the office?
I think first and foremost, you have to manage a hybrid team consciously. So you have to actually think about, how are you going to lead this team? And not just today, not just when you start creating this hybrid team, but also over the long term. What is the difference going to be between the hybrid team and the team that perhaps you had pre-pandemic, where everybody came to a particular workplace? How are you actually going to engage with that? And I actually think it needs much more conscious management than perhaps pre-pandemic, which is a good thing. So I think it's really thinking through what it means in the context of your organization to have hybrid working. And there's a lot of people out there who suggest that thinking about hybrid working should be akin to thinking about a philosophy. So what are the values? What can we do to ensure that people are able to maximize their productivity and to achieve the maximum satisfaction from working for us as an organization? So I think there are things we need to take out of the packet, if you will, and think about. So, for example, if we've got hybrid working, whatever the mix is that your organization decides to go with, we need to move away from what has perhaps been a cultural norm in some places, that flexible working isn't a privilege. It doesn't imply a lack of ambition or a lack of commitment, but it's a reasonable choice for people to make. And I think that's where you have to start from, that it's a reasonable choice, and it shouldn't be career limiting, and it shouldn't be more difficult to be either working from home, working from another location, or in the office part of the time and out of the office part of the time. That shouldn't be more difficult than being in the office all of the time. So you really need to stand back, I think, and think about what it means in terms of your organisation and the things that your organisation values, the things that your organisation measures, and the things that your organisation rewards. And they need to be consistent with each other. So I think it's about conscious awareness, because I think it's very easy, the potential is clearly there to create two tiers of employment. The people who are in the workplace physically and the people who aren't. And there is a danger that the people who are not in the workplace as often, or perhaps work at home or offsite all of the time, don't have the same access to opportunities. They don't have the same access to senior managers. They don't have the same inclusivity when it comes to communications, to meetings, to informal engagements. And they become disadvantaged. There is that really serious danger that could happen. And I think that's something which really needs to be thought through. So I think it has to be at a conscious level. I think organizations have to really determine what they mean by hybrid working, what the processes are that are going to support that are going to mean it is inclusive, and that there isn't going to be this two-tier system, and how things have to change to do that. Because we can't just carry on as though everybody was in the office or everybody was in the workplace and just, somehow assume that by some sort of magic, what we do in the workplace will sort of trickle out. It'll permeate out to everybody who should have known, and somehow that will happen through osmosis or some other fashion. But we need to consciously think about the means of making that happen. What processes need to be put in place? What equipment do we need to provide staff with? So, for example, if you don't think through the Wi-Fi and computer access, are people being disadvantaged because they can't access the kit you've got in the office or you've got in the workplace? And is that reasonable? Is that actually hampering their ability to do the job that you need them to do? And how should the organisation best tackle that? How can they support that? One of the issues for people who have been home working over a long period of time that has been certainly raised in the various studies that have been done is poor support from their organisation in terms of connectivity. And that's particularly an issue for junior staff. What you often find is the senior staff have wonderful, all singing, all dancing, computer equipment and connectivity and everything else, and the junior staff don't have the same privilege. And that inequality, that imbalance can actually hit your productivity. And it can also mean that people become less satisfied with you as an employing organisation. And when there are currently so many vacancies out there, is that really the place you want to be as an employer? I think not.
It feels like there's sort of there's a rethinking of the technology that we used to use in the office versus the technology we use at home, and I guess it's how do we, when we're managing hybrid teams, again rethinking not just sitting everybody in the office on a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, but how can we get the best out of the people that are in the office? And again, I think as you've mentioned, that means that we need to think about the technology, the kit that we're providing to our staff, but also ensuring that there is a adequate Wi-Fi.
I think so. I think all of those things come into play. Certainly, we give that a lot of thought in terms, or we did pre-pandemic. We gave that a lot of thought in terms of the people sitting in the workplace. What kit do they need? What resources do they need? And putting those in place. Well, if you're going to go into a hybrid mode of working, you've got to extend that to whatever location your employees are in. What kit do they need? What resources do they need to do the job we need them to do? Because otherwise you're disadvantaging the people who are not physically in the workplace. And while you might say, well, we could use that as an incentive to come in, is the ability to connect via Wi-Fi a big enough incentive to make that journey, to make that commitment to come in? Or do you go looking for an employer that perhaps will give you more support to work at home?
I guess it was one of the we've sort of touched on this but what do leaders need to do to make sure that those who are present in the office don't have that preferential treatment? So obviously we talked about the level of the technology levelers. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about as leaders to be more
I think,
inclusive?
again, it's coming from the perspective of being inclusive. How do you make sure that the people who are not sitting in front of you, standing in front of you, are actually the only people that you think about when you are thinking about, say, assigning projects or opportunities to do different and new things? When you're giving communication messages, when you're giving messages to people, how are the messages reaching all of your team, not just the people who are present? It's very easy to fall into the trap of what's called presenteeism bias or proximity bias, which is we only think about the people that we can actually physically see. And really that would lead to the two-tier system I mentioned earlier of employment, where you have a group of people who are being disadvantaged because they're not physically present, even though you've agreed that they shouldn't be physically present. And whatever way you look at that's not fair. So it's thinking about your communication channels. I have, for example, heard of an organization where everybody joins the meeting via Zoom, whether they're in the workplace or not. So even if they're in the building, sitting at their desk, they join a meeting via Zoom. So everybody's in a level playing field in that sense. And that might be something to think about and to experiment with. Having standardized meeting times can be helpful, because that way and everybody has in their diary a point at which they are all going to come together, however you organize that, whether that's the day you bring the whole team in, whether that's the day that you say everybody will join by Zoom, however you do it. But it's actually consciously thinking through how these things will happen and keeping that going, not just for the first 2 months when the people start coming back into the workplace. But if you're going to put hybrid working in place or home working in place, you've really got to think about it in the long term. And it really does have to be a conscious part of how we decide to lead. So we have to actually really, as leaders and managers, is really to think in our heads about what it means for us and how we engage with all of the staff that we have, not just those that we can physically see.
You mentioned something at the start of this. It's allocating work and having fairness of allocation, again, to make sure that, sort of, for example, junior staff members who don't have such a broad reputation within the organisation. So I guess providing fairness to opportunity internally once people have joined the organisation is going to be important, and also I suppose as well, turn that on its head, that it actually means that as an employer you are developing all your staff, so you don't have you're not narrowing down your pool of talented resources within the organisation.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's particularly important for junior staff or those who've joined the organisation during the pandemic, because in that sense they haven't physically been present to establish themselves. So I think it's particularly important to think, how are we going to ensure that those people are given an equal and fair access and recognition compared to the staff perhaps who we were very familiar with before the lockdown, and make sure that they have similar opportunities. One of the things to think about, for example, is what parts of your training can you actually make digital or that you can record? So they're always there for people to access wherever they are. And meetings, could you record meetings? So if people can't be present for whatever reason, could you record those meetings and make them available so that people don't feel they've lost out? I think one of the things in terms of new joiners to really think about as well is when they come into the workplace, making sure there are arrangements where they can actually sit with people or work with people that they can learn from, because we do a lot of our learning through observation in our occupations, and that's been very difficult via Zoom or Google Hangout or whatever you've used. But that's really difficult to do if you don't actually have that physical proximity. It's one of the things that used to be called sitting by Nelly in training, where you actually sat with somebody and they showed you how to do the job. Now, while that's not a formal part of your training, for any newcomer to an organisation or any junior member of staff, perhaps who has recently joined the workforce, that's really important. And over the last 18 months, that's really just not been possible to replicate. So I think giving actual conscious thought to making those things happen or facilitating ways in which those things can happen is really important. And so it's I think all of these things are possible, but we have to stand back and question some of the assumptions perhaps we had before, and not just assume what worked pre-pandemic will work now, particularly as we move into different forms of organisation, and we're dealing with people whose expectations have changed. It's as simple as that, because none of us are the same people that we were pre-pandemic.
I guess one of the things as well is sort of helping leaders to reimagine what good looks like, what we thought good looked like as a pre-pandemic, what in terms of assessing people's performance at work and how engagement, what good engagement looks like in a hybrid model. So that's going to take some thinking through, isn't it? And
it is going to take some thinking through, and I think that's got to be particular to a given organisation and a given role, obviously. But it's actually standing back and thinking clearly, what is it that we need as an output, and how can we sensibly assess that it's being met? Is it an output that needs to happen in a particular place? Because for some people, their roles can only happen in particular places. For other people, the location really isn't that important. Provided they have the right connectivity, they can do what they do wherever they are. And it's being very clear about the nature of the output, the expectations surrounding that. What do we expect from you, and how will we assess it? And then how will we reward it? And I think in terms of managers themselves, there's going to be a much bigger emphasis on emotional intelligence and the sort of social skills, the empathy, the compassion for people, because that's going to be really important in terms of making the new scenario work and creating collaborative, effective and productive teams.
Excellent. I mean, finally, I mean, I guess we talk about how do we now we're reimagining place. So now we're no longer bound to the physical bricks and mortar of an office. How can we create a sense of belonging at work? How do we reimagine what that workplace is?
I think in some ways we do have to reimagine it, and in some ways, I think perhaps pre-pandemic we were a little bit lazy about that, in the sense that the fact we made you come to our place of work that had the big badge emblazoned on it that said we are these people, and it's all in the corporate colours, and it's all, you sit in these spaces and you work with these people. That allowed us to almost think, well, we'll create a sense of belonging almost by default. We didn't have to necessarily give it a great deal of thought. That's not true everywhere, and I know some organisations have worked very hard on creating their brand, their personality, their style. But inevitably, when the bricks and mortars were involved, the way we laid out our workplaces, the things we included or didn't include, all created that sense of an identity, if you will. And we almost did that. Once we'd done it, it was done and it was there. But I think we can't do that now. We have to really think about what it means to belong to our organisation. And I think it's an opportunity to not forget all the good things we learned through the pandemic. We were in many cases forced to move everything online really quickly, and people did that and showed it could be done. And then we've had to learn over the last 18 months lots of ways of engaging people, creating that sense of belonging, creating that sense of connectivity. And managers have had to work really hard to do that. And I think we need to take those lessons forward. Let's not just forget them, because we're out, once the pandemic is past, let's not just forget them, because that would be such a waste. There have been so many good practices that people have engaged with that have really helped people to gel, regardless of the fact that we're having to do everything virtually, that we should take that forward. So, because belonging shouldn't just be about the bricks and mortar. Belonging should be about the brand, the ethos, the team, the people that you work with, the service that you're committed to, the objectives that you all believe in, the team goals that you're all committed to. That's what belonging should be about. It shouldn't be about this building or this corporate style or this banner above the doorway. That's not what it should be about. It should be about, we are proud to be part of this enterprise, whatever that enterprise is, and we believe in what this enterprise is doing.
It goes back to organisational culture and organisational climate, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Through the crisis, we pulled together.
Yeah.
Now we're not in crisis management mode anymore. How do we continue to harness that sort of collaboration and that sort of desire to achieve things?
Yeah, build on what has been achieved in the last 18 months. Take it and run with it and really develop it so it continues to work for you hand in hand with other things, which we now can do, which we couldn't do before. If you can harness both things and get them to work together, it should mean you can be stronger than we were before.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's a fantastic note to leave that point on, Denise. So thanks for talking us through these topics. So I'll now hand over to my board colleague, Sarah, who's going to ask you some of the questions that were pre-submitted or have been submitted by viewers during the live session today.
Great stuff.
Thank you, Catherine. So our first pre-submitted question is, do we need to revisit the cultural norms of behaviour that were prevalent before COVID, such as dress code or 9 to 5?
In short, well, you won't be surprised, given what I've already said, that I would say yes, we do. Some of those norms were there because of habit. And I think we really need to consider how useful those norms are now. I think if you can think through the norms, like dress code, if the dress code is adding something and there's a clear explanation as to why the dress code is what it is, and that can be explained to people, then it's worth considering keeping it if it's working, if it's contributing something. But if the norm that you're considering is not actually adding value, why is it there? And because we've had this break, it's a great opportunity to reconsider some of those norms, because people, in a sense, are coming back fresh. We're entering into a new stage of the way that we work. And it is a great sort of line in the sand that says, let's just reconsider where we are and what is useful, and not just continue things because they were habit.
Yeah, absolutely. So next we've got a live question from Dan. Have you got any tips for smaller organisations adopting hybrid working, and how to avoid people coming to an almost empty office with so many others working remotely? Many people are missing the buzz of the office.
Hi, Dan. Yeah, really good question. I think the buzz of the office is one of the big attractors, if you will, one of the ways that you can sort of value add to people to say, come into the office for this. And I think it's really important that you think about how people are organising to come in the office. There's nothing worse than coming into the office to think, well, I'll go into the office because I can talk to so-and-so, we can really do something on this, and then so-and-so decides to stay at home and write a report. Really frustrating for the person who went to the trouble of going into the office. So I think it's about having discussions, particularly in a small organisation, having discussions with the group and agreeing how to organise that face time in the office. So it's meaningful for people. And if people book to be in the office, unless there's a really unexpected reason why they can't, such as illness or whatever, then they should try to honour that. So if people have arranged to come into the office to connect with particular individuals, they're fairly certain those individuals will be there. Because otherwise you don't have the buzz, and you could end up with one person sitting there all on their own, which really isn't going to feel terribly great, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Denise. So the next question is a pre-submitted one. What are the leadership traits that are important in the new hybrid way of working?
I touched on those earlier, and just to say a little bit more about them, I think we really need to recognise that having a dialogue with people is going to be so important, and really recognising that there are going to be different perspectives on returning to the workplace, different perspectives in terms of people's experience of the last 18 months and their expectations, and really trying to understand those. So the emotional empathy, the emotional intelligence, the social skills of listening to people, being an active listener and really hearing what people are telling you, because you need to respond in an authentic way to their concerns, and you need to respond in an authentic way to what they want to get out of being in the workplace, because that way you can make the return a positive experience. rather than something which people resent or feel is really not working for them. And if things aren't working for people, you need to listen. You need to understand why it's not working. What is the issue for them? How can you help? How can you manage the situation so it becomes more positive for them? Because at the end of the day, most people want a positive experience in terms of their work. And if they get that positive experience, they're more productive, you're more likely to retain them. And everybody benefits, to be honest. So I think the softer skills of management are going to be really, really important.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So the next question we've had sent in is a live question from Mark, who says, we've just moved to hybrid working. How do we prevent a split amongst teams between those who are going into the office and getting the additional social interaction and those who don't? I know that's something that you've sort of touched on before, but a real sense of a split between those in the office and those at home, and what we can do about that.
Hi, Mark. It partly depends on the nature of the hybrid working, how you organise that, what your nature of your hybrid working is. If it is that you've got some people who are always in the office and some people who are never in the office, then I think you really have to think about how you can connect the two parts of the team together. How can you ensure that connectivity and ensure that the people who are never in the physically in the workplace are not being treated differently and disadvantaged? So some of the things I mentioned earlier are really important in terms of the support they're being offered, in terms of how messages are being communicated, how you are integrating and involving them in activities such as the formal ones such as meetings, but also any social interaction that's going on. I have come across some workplaces where they actually have what they call a gossip hour, and everybody is online online in the office, as it were, and they're literally working on their own stuff, but everybody's in the space, the virtual space, so they literally can do it as they would do if they were sitting next to each other and just have a chat about anything. Doesn't matter, but it's a gossip space, if you will. And I don't use the word gossip in a negative sense. I'm using it in the positive sense of people just touching base with each other, sharing information about what they're thinking, how they're feeling about something, what the latest view on the football is, whatever it is, doesn't matter, but they've got that interaction space. And I know some organizations are trying that, and it's certainly working for some. So it's thinking in your context of how can we ensure that we've got the connectivity between different parts of the teams. If you've got a hybrid system where all of the people are coming in for some of the time, so for example, you may have organized it so everybody's coming in 2 days a week, it would then be a case of planning those 2 days a week in a way that meant appropriate groups of people were in the office at the same time or in the workplace at the same time. So, and that may mean switching people about sometimes, depending what they're working on and depending who they need to be connecting with. But it's about ensuring that it's less of that it's a more planned approach to ensure that those connections can happen. It's going to take time to get used to because we're not used to having to plan those things.
I like the sound of a gossip hour. I think that's a great
I
thing.
haven't tried it myself, but I thought it was a great idea. I don't know whether nobody ever speaks, but they just have their head down working, or whether actually they really do, once they're used to it, whether they really do sort of just, pass. The idea is you can just pass comments to each other, just as you would if you were sat around a table. Because one of the things I think a lot of people have missed doing everything on Zoom is it's really hard to be spontaneously funny. You can't just, do a quick quip or a quick aside or whatever, because on Zoom it feels rude because you don't want to talk over somebody else, and also I think Zoom for a lot of people feels more formal, whereas if you were all sat in your office or in your stood around your workplace, whatever you were doing, people would make those funny asides, they would make those funny observations and share them, and that helps build the team, it helps build that sort of sense of belonging, helps build trust. And I think what people are trying to experiment with is different ways of letting that happen, even if everybody isn't in the same physical space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the next question we'll go to then is a pre-submitted question from Sarah. How do we create a collaborative, collective leadership culture in a virtual space?
Okay, good question, Sarah. I think this is an area which really where it's really important for us not to lose what we've learned. over the last 18 months or so, we've all been having to create our leadership culture, our organizational culture, and maintain it in a virtual space. And we've learned lots of lessons about what to do and what not to do. And I think it's really building on that. There's lots of research pre-pandemic that suggested that it was much easier to build shared cultures and shared trust if you physically met first and then became a virtual team. Clearly, that's not been possible over the pandemic in every case, because people have changed jobs, people have moved on, joined us, whatever. But it's about, I think one of the important things is actually about having discussions at the outset about how this is going to work. How is this collaborative process, this collective process, how do we want it to work? What's our individual commitment to make this happen? What is my responsibility in terms of creating this culture, contributing to this culture, and being very clear about that? So rather than just assuming, actually put that on the table and talk about it and agree as a group how that is going to work. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to share things? What are your touch points? What are the things that are so important to you as a leadership team that you as a leadership team want to embed them in your culture? And agree what they are, but really make sure that you have a shared understanding and a shared commitment. And that's only going to come through dialogue, I think. And really being honest and exploring those things up front. And then being able to take that forward and touch back every so often. You know, you need to have touch points where you check that it's working. You check that the understanding is still shared. You check that the commitment is still there. And if it isn't, or the shared understanding has changed, again, you need to revisit. What do we want? What do we mean? What are we committed to? What's our value set? And I think those are the really important things that we need to do wherever we are, whether we're doing it virtually, whether we're doing it face to face. It doesn't matter. As a leadership team, those are the really key things that we need to understand.
Great. So next we have another live question from Mike. How can we maximise engagement in MS Teams meetings with remote workers and a mix under hybrid?
Hi, Mike. This is something I think a lot of people are trying to get their heads around at the minute. And it doesn't have to be MS Teams. It can be Zoom, it can be Hangout, it can be whatever you're doing. But the mix of virtual and in person, as it were, meetings can be a challenge. And again, I think it needs proactivity on the part of the person who is chairing the meeting. You need to recognize actually that you've got multiple types of audience and be sure to bring both audiences in to the meeting. It's very easy to be tempted to focus on the people who are sitting in front of you and forget that you have people who perhaps are joining you virtually. And that's one of the reasons I think where some organizations are doing all meetings virtually, regardless of where the people are, because that way everybody's got the same access, but that may not be appropriate for your workplace. So I think it's about really proactive chairing of the meeting in terms of making sure people are engaging as you would in a physical meeting. If there are people who are not saying anything, if there are people who are not contributing, as the chair, you need to bring them in. You need to ask about their thoughts on something. You need to invite them to speak. You may want to organize your meeting so that everybody has part of the agenda that they are going to lead on, in which case they have no choice but to be involved and engaged. But I think what it does need is active chairing, very active chairing, which can be very tiring. It's more tiring than doing it just in person around a table. But I think it's part of what, as managers, we have to accept is the new way of actively engaging.
Absolutely. So a really interesting question has come in, actually, another live question from Fabrizio. What are the new strategic competences that organisations or HR should develop to support hybrid working?
Oh, Fabrizio, that's an easy question. Sorry, that's an interesting question, but not an easy question to answer. And it depends what you mean by strategic competencies. So I wonder whether Fabrizio can just expand that a little bit. What he means by strategic competencies in this context. Is that possible to do?
We could maybe come on to another question and come back to that.
Yeah, and if we could come back, if Fabrizio can expand that a little bit for me.
Fantastic. So next we have another live question then from Anwar, who is asking, how do we address the narrative that some people have become lazy during lockdown? Do we need to reframe how we measure productivity and effectiveness?
I don't accept the premise that some people have become lazy during lockdown. I think the evidence is that productivity has increased in many places. And I think if people are lazy in lockdown, they probably were lazy in the office, to be honest. Because if you're not productive, you're not productive. Doesn't matter where you are. And I think poor performance has to be managed, whether that person is physically present or not physically present. So it's not a premise that I accept that people have become lazy. I think a lot of people actually have worked harder during lockdown than they worked previously for lots of different reasons. I think an element of that has been us all rising to meet the challenge of the crisis. But I do think a lot of people, because they felt that they were balancing their work life better, because they didn't have other distractions that they experienced in the office, a lot of people feel they've actually been far more productive. So I'm afraid I don't sign up to the premise that people have become more lazy during lockdown. I've seen no evidence of that.
Thank you, Denise. So another question we'll go to now is a pre-submitted question. So is there any evidence in terms of productivity, how effective working at home has been versus working in the office? Any stats or figures that you've come across?
There are quite a lot of surveys out there, not least by the Office for National Statistics, who recently published a report based on figures gathered earlier this year. Certainly the general view of the people who are working at home is that they mostly feel far more productive. Different surveys quote different rates, but some, to the extent of some say they're twice as productive. A lot of people feel that, well, a lot of employers have responded that they also feel that they get better production with people having worked at home. Lots of different reasons for that. But I think one of the key things to think about is the fact that there's a lot of research evidence for a long period of time before the pandemic, but sort of reinforced by the pandemic. People feel and are more productive when they feel in control, when they feel in control of their work-life balance, when they feel in control of their workload. A lot of people have reported during the pandemic they felt far more trusted by their managers. They felt that they were being given the responsibility for achieving, and that was being recognized, and as a result felt they were more productive. And a lot of employers have reported that they felt that the people working at home were more productive. So on that basis, I think there's a lot of positive impact of working from home or in a flexible way that works for you, because people want different types of flexibility and different levels of flexibility. And some, as I say, some people just want to be in the workplace. They're happy being in the workplace, whereas other people don't want to be in the workplace at all. And you've got every permutation in between. But all the evidence suggests that home working can lead to greater productivity. Having said that, over time, if the people who are home working don't get the support that they feel they need from their employer, that can decline. So if they're not getting support with the resources, they're not getting support with the connectivity, then productivity can dip because people are less satisfied. And wherever people are less satisfied with their workplace and their employer, productivity dips.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. So we've got another live question in now from Gareth, which is another really interesting one actually. Any advice on how to handle contractual changes? Around 50% of employees have the office as their place of work and the rest have home. So for any contractual changes that might need to happen, are people thinking about changing contracts of employment, or is now just this more of an implied way of working, I guess?
Varies organisation to organisation. Some are just having just a variation in the way of working. Others are actually moving to contractual changes. I would always say take legal advice, get your HR advice. There are processes you have to follow to make contractual changes. If you want to stay within the letter of the law and you don't want to be liable to a tribunal or some other form of legal action, you have to be careful with changing people's contract, and there are processes you must go through to do that. Variation in terms of people's attendance can be the subject of just a local agreement, if you will. It doesn't have to necessitate a contractual change. But where it does, and some organisations are going down this road, you have to take the right advice before you do that and make sure that you follow the correct processes.
Absolutely. So we have the last live question now, and we've actually had Fabrizio come back to us to expand on his point. Good. So by strategic competencies, I meant, for example, designing new HR roles focused on technology or mental or physical well-being.
Great, thank you for that, Fabrizio, that helps. Yes, I think some organisations are moving on this. They have actually appointed people specifically with roles to look at hybrid working, or to look at the use of technology, the provision of support for staff who are not attending the office full time. So yeah, definitely these new roles are being created. Some of the issues relate to contractual issues, but some of them are about well-being and being seen to actively support staff in the transition to new ways of working. So very much, I think there are new roles. They may be in HR, they may not be in HR. But definitely new roles coming through, and definitely new policies, new support, new well-being strategies being introduced in many organisations.
Fantastic, thank you. So in the interest of time now then, Denise, I'll ask for your 3 key takeaways if possible, please.
Okay, my 3 key takeaways, and again, I don't think you're going to be surprised when I say what they are, given what I've been talking about. We need to give conscious thought to how to make it worthwhile to come into the office and how we're going to use the workplace space. It needs to add value for the organisation, but also for the employee, for the person who's coming in. Why should they make the effort? What are they going to get out of it? People don't just accept, I think, anymore that you go to work, you go to a place. I think they want there to be a reason to go to that place. I think we have a unique opportunity to reconsider our workplaces and to think about our operating models in the future, and perhaps to reconfigure ourselves so we're actually better set up, ready for what the future is going to throw at us. It's not been of our choosing, but we actually have been given a pause for thought, if you will, and a chance to actually reconfigure if we choose to do that. And I don't want us to lose those positive lessons. We've learned a lot during the last 18 months. It's not all been negative. And I'd really like to see people take those positive lessons forward. And the last thing, I think, and my absolute prime key takeaway, if you will, is you've got to talk. You've got to have dialogue with the people who are coming back to the workplace, who you want to come back into the workplace, who are experiencing hybrid working maybe for the first time, who are struggling with the new processes, the new ways of engaging. And you've got to talk, and you've got to actively listen to what you're being told and respond appropriately. Even if the responding appropriately means we can't do this because, it's really important that people are clear, your expectations are clear, and the processes are clear, and that people understand them. So if people do nothing else, they need to constructively talk and engage with the people that they are seeking to switch to hybrid working or into the new workplace.
Fantastic, that's great. Thank you very much, Denise. I'm going to hand back over to Catherine now for a wrap up.
Can't hear you, Catherine.
Do apologise. Sorry about that. So yeah, thanks, Denise. It's been really interesting and insightful. We've had far more questions than we could hope to address in an hour, so it's definitely a topic that people are finding really useful. I'd like to thank you for your time today. Just to let everybody know, we are going to be posting on our social media account to keep the conversation going. So look for the hashtag Management Transformed and continue to share your experiences and questions too.
That was great, Catherine. Thank you. I enjoyed that. Great questions, everybody.
Perfect. So unfortunately, that is it for today's session. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and thank you to Denise, Catherine and Sarah for your insights and expertise on the topic. If you're a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat, where you can find a wide range of exclusive and practical development resources and much more. And if you're not yet subscribed, why not join our community via the link as well in the live chat, where you can gain full access to our Management Direct portal. You can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter as well. Please also do take a few moments to let us know your thoughts on today's event by completing the evaluation form. The link is also in the live chat. And we have also recently published a report on hybrid working. The link will also be shared in the live chat as well as the follow-up email. So thank you again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.